Good morning. I would like to begin this event by thanking the people who have made it possible. First of all, I want to thank our speaker, Georg Northoff, for his presence, for being here, coming to the university to give us this lecture. I would also like to thank all those people who have been available and have collaborated in organizing this event, especially Isabella, Tatiana, Carolina, and Billy. My thanks also go to Manolo and Laura, who very kindly went to pick up our speaker this morning to the airport. I also want to thank the people here in the university for the technicians who have given us the room and the resources to make this possible. Dr. Northoff is a psychiatrist, philosopher, and neuroscientist, which already speaks about the amplitude of his and the growth of his intellectual and scientific interests. Originally from Germany, he is currently a professor at the Royal Ottawa University. He's one of the most prominent voices in the field of contemporary neuroscience. It is quite difficult to pin down exactly what Dr. Northoff's specific area of research is, as his contributions range from the study of the self, consciousness, psychiatric disorders, amongst others. We could say that in reality what he is working is nothing less than shaping a new paradigm in neuroscience, the spatiotemporal theory, especially in search of a common currency between subjective experience and brain function. However, I do not want to emphasize only Dr. Northoff's remarkable curriculum or scientific contributions, because science is not only about research, discovering new phenomena, or the publication of papers. Science is something more than that. It's a human activity, and a particularly hierarchical one. One of the things that struck me most when I get to know Georg on the internet was when I was watching a lecture on YouTube about the spatiotemporal theory of consciousness, and I could notice how much he cited his students, praising their abilities and their work. 2 years ago, before starting my PhD, I reached out to him to ask about the relationships between the spontaneous and evoked activity. What happens when we see something? What happens? How this interacts with our ongoing activity? And he very kindly agreed to meet with me, and that meeting is what gave rise to my doctoral thesis. Of course, this is not about me, but rather about Dr. Northoff's relationship with his students, how he gives space to their ideas, how he trusts them, how he embraces their work. And it is this, alongside his great scientific contributions, that makes Georg a truly outstanding scientist. With that said, I now give floor to our speaker, Dr. Northoff. Thank you very much.
So, thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Thanks for Diego, and really nice introduction. I talked to you about something which is really more and more topic, AI and consciousness, artificial intelligence, and that obviously we're daily confronted with it, ChatGPT. So in the meantime, of course, we find out that ChatGPT is always very polite, but it can also lie. So now the question is, has ChatGPT or DeepSeek in China, do they have subjective experience of what they do? Do they have a bad feeling when they lie? Yeah, that's the kind of things we have. So, and I take a very clear stance here, and you will hear my clear stance at the end. I think there are some lessons from the brain to be learned. And the interesting thing is the lessons to be learned from the brain for AI may also be lessons for the brain itself, because we haven't really understood the brain-mind connection. And that's all basically I'm after. So, and I say the current debate in neuroscience and philosophy about consciousness, and I explicitly say in the Western world. because there's a different philosophical framework in the Eastern world, like in India and China. So there are some errors which I think really prevent us and block our view from what it really is. So, and that already tells you there is a close link between the conceptual and the empirical. First error, we always think, we originally thought consciousness is in our mind. Now that goes back to Descartes, a philosopher at the beginning of the 15th, 16th century. And now we think it's somewhere in a special feature in the brain. Yeah? Like a special region or a special mechanism distinct from the rest of the brain. That's on the side. The second error is that consciousness, we think, it's sort of mental. Yeah? Because you cannot measure it, you cannot see it, like this little cup. So that's why we think it's mental. And then, of course, if you think it's mental, all the discussion, is it physical or not? Yeah? And the third thing, consciousness is different from anything else we see in the natural world, and therefore it's somewhat special. So then what I will do is I will discard all three arguments and say they're simply not plausible. You see I show you a lot of empirical data and say none of these three is plausible. And that basically, and before I go into some of the details, I tell you what I do mean by consciousness, because I'm sure I don't know how many people are here in the room. If I were asking what you think about consciousness, we probably get 100 different opinions. Yeah, so it's sort of an umbrella term which assumes a lot of different issues, and there we are. So when I speak of consciousness, I mean subjective experience. So here, oh God, Northoff is talking. I saw him on YouTube, and now the same shit starts again. It's boring. Yeah, so you have a feeling of boredom. Yeah, and that feeling of boredom, that's what I mean by experience. Yeah, so maybe AI could listen in exactly the same way, show the same behavior to the talk without experience anything. Yeah, and that experience is a certain quality which is often discussed as a what it is like, or qualia in the current discussion, but I will come back to that later. Yeah, so there may be yes, you show a behavioral reaction to the talk of to the talk of Northoff, meaning you walk out, yeah, same as the other person who also walks out, but you may not feel anything. Yeah, you don't have this experience of boredom. So that's what I mean, and I keep this is more for the philosophers, so I probably skip that. What is important that I try to avoid this perennial discussion. Is it reductive versus non-reductive? Is consciousness just the brain or brain and body, or is it something different? I think that's a wrong alternative. Yeah, and the reason there are a lot of conceptual reasons for that. So my talk will basically first address these errors, and at the fourth I come back to the AI. So the first error, remember, consciousness is inside. I say no, consciousness is not here. It's not there, it's between you and me. So it's relational. Then the second, I think, remember we said that conscious contents are mental. Yeah? You always, when you look into Google, what is mental, you see a cloud. Yeah? Cloud above the earth, different from earth. That signifies the mental. Okay, I say no, it's intrinsically temporal. Yeah? It's temporal, it has a temporal structure, and that makes consciousness. And the third one, remember that I said that consciousness, the third error, that consciousness has a specific, is very special. Yeah, it's a mind, Descartes said it's a mind on top of the body. Now we say it's a special region within the brain. I said no, it's completely non-special, based on non-special features. And then those discussions serve me to address the fourth question. So I will start with the first error or mystery of consciousness, that consciousness is inside your head rather than outside in the world. Yeah, so Descartes said, okay, there's a mind. The mind is somewhere connected through a little organ in the brain, the epiphysis. And now we say, okay, maybe, I know I can use this one too. Maybe it's either this region here, the posterior region, or the anterior region. This is a global neuronal workspace theory. This is the integrated information theory. But I say no, none of that applies. because some people say it comes from the thalamus. So no, I think it's a whole brain. And I will make you now the point. So how do I make my argument and show the data? So first for me, and this is very important, consciousness is not in your head, it's not in your mind, it's not in your brain, it's not in the body. How do you experience consciousness? When you perceive me, I assume you're conscious, everybody in the room, I hope so, unless you have a good sleep, so I wish you some good dreams. Yeah? So if your consciousness, you become aware of yourself relative to the rest of the room and relative in distance to me. If I were moving now a little bit closer, your consciousness of me would change, despite the content remains the same. Yeah? Now, sorry, I know I should not move as much for the camera. Now I move here. Yeah? So now your consciousness says again. So maybe now I experience Northoff completely different than when he was standing there. Now I see he has a blue pants, it's all blue, the guy is completely blue. You weren't aware of that before. Yeah? So your consciousness changes, for instance, based on the spatial distance. So that means is your relationship to that. And we're often not aware of that. You experience yourself as part of this wider room. So imagine, if this room would, instead of, I don't know, 300 chairs or whatever chairs here are, this room would only contain 50 chairs and would be much smaller. You would experience yourself and your relation to me in a completely different way. You know this. You have all these beautiful buildings here in Madrid, the architecture with high ceilings or lower ceilings, and that shapes your experience. Yeah? Also the experience of the other person in the room. So consciousness is, and I think it's a fundamental mistake of Western tradition, it's not in here. It's not in the brain, it's not in the body, it's between you and me. It's intrinsically relational. So why do I say that? Because our environment, and now I show you some support for that, our environment is continuously changing. Yeah? Continuously changing, like you listen to music or you go to the seaside, it continuously changes. There are certain dynamic patterns. Yeah, and dynamics is for me here preliminary defined patterns of change, this over time. Yeah, and the interesting thing, the brain is nothing special. Look, this is a time series from the brain. You have seismic earth wave, you have sea waves. So it's continuously changing, so there's a certain dynamics. And the brain too has a dynamic. And that dynamics, so pattern of changes over time, there's continuously change, fluctuations, variability. You can measure that. Yeah, you can measure that with the traditional frequency bands like in EEG or also in fMRI and the slower range. But you have also various measures from engineering which describe this kind of dynamics. So and this is what I'm after. So now you say, how is that? So here, some of you know this, particularly Diego who deals with that. You can measure also your power spectrum. There's usually more power in the slower frequency ranges here. If you're very slow, this is about 100-second change here, waves 100-second, and here it's much faster, called gamma in EEG, and most of you know that. Yeah? So, and you can measure, it's not only the single frequency, but how these different frequencies relate to each other. And that's what you can describe as a scale-free activity, or the slope, steepness of the slope of the power spectrum. Yeah, that's a typical power spectrum. This is frequency, this is power. Here you have faster frequencies, here you have power. The more higher, the more power. And again, go to the seaside, it's not that far from here. You see the the faster waves have not much power. You're really afraid of the slower waves because they're more powerful, that they push you right away back to the beach. Yeah? So, and then the question is, here, now why I say that? Because the brain shares its inner dynamics, its waves, tries to align and follow the waves of the environment. Yeah, we call this alignment. And this is one of the most amazing things. Now you say, you have no idea what Northoff is talking here. Just give you the example of music. When you listen to music you like, now you can't see this, you dance to the rhythm, to the music. Yeah, you unconsciously do tap with your foot, even if you don't want to listen to, you unconsciously follow those rhythms. You have no choice. It's automatic. Your brain does the job for you. And the better you follow the rhythm of the music, the better you have the feeling of the groove of the music. Yeah? So that's a typical form of alignment, and that's usually unconscious. Even in interpersonal relationships, observe yourself. When the one person does like this, you immediately get into the same position. I noticed that myself as a psychiatrist, psychotherapist. It's amazing, yeah? And you have no choice, yeah? So your brain wants to follow the temporal patterns in the environment. So here I show you an example, which is, I'm still amazed by that. So here we present every 50, 60 seconds a 2-second stimulus. 2 seconds, short stimulus with some autobiographical or heterobiographical memory. 2 seconds. And in between, we have 50 to 60 seconds, nothing. Yeah? For the experts among you, we have a fixation cross, the intertrial intervals. Yeah? And what we observe a peak in the power spectrum in this is the paradigm, so in exactly that frequency of these 52 seconds. So I show you that in the next one. So here, this is a pure, you see here, this is the frequency of your stimuli, of your rhythm, the every 50, 60 seconds. This is around this frequency range. Yeah, so we recalculate the duration between the stimuli in terms of frequency. And then we can measure the power in that frequency in the brain of the people. And here you can, for instance, observe this is pure in the resting state, so no paradigm, no stimuli at all. And here you see a clear peak, you see an elevation in exactly that frequency where the stimuli are presented. So your brain really tracks the stimuli. So it's amazing, and we have you see a lot of papers recently on that by us on our website. So your brain constantly tries to synchronize, align, and adapt. And that's really key, and I think it's an often neglected. Here I give you another example. So here we presented emotional phases versus scrambled phases with blocks of 20 seconds, 20-second control, 20-second emotion, and so forth. And here this is called the fusiform phase area, key region for phase processing. And you see again in the resting state, no phases. You don't see the peak, but here in the task state, you see the peak in the power spectrum in exactly these 20 seconds because this is 0.25. So when we first saw the data at the time we published this, we had no idea what it is. Then we reanalyzed the data now some years later, and that's exactly what came up. So it's remarkable. Yeah, even over longer periods, your brain memorizes that. It follows, it tracks, and that's unconscious. Yeah, and there are other papers now where we show that this is also behaviorally relevant. For instance, shapes your working memory. The better you can track the rhythm, the better your working memory. Yeah, so this is absolutely key. So now you say, Northoff, all nice and dandy, how is that related to consciousness? So here I show you the example. So here we conducted another study done by Philip Klar, who is our fMRI expert and really focuses on this temporal spatial alignment and consciousness. And Diego knows he's pretty brilliant. So here you see again, same subject in the awake state. You see again these power increases in exactly the frequency in which the blocks were presented. These were 25 to 35 second blocks. You could see this here, and again you see this increase. And now what happens in anesthesia? Nothing. Yeah. So you cannot track your environmental temporal structure anymore. Remember what I said earlier? Consciousness, you experience yourself as part of the wider world. In order to do that, you somehow need to track your environmental context, and that the brain does it. Yeah? So that's why your experience, that's what our working hypothesis is, that's why your experience sort of goes beyond or transcends your body boundaries as part of the environment. So, and here this is again what we call temporal spatial alignment, and this is of course not only on the longer time scales, but also on shorter time scales. So this is ultimately, it's different layers. Yeah, your brain is probably organized in different layers of time scales. So what do I mean by time scale? Look here into the window. There are some windows here, it's not many, but you see, and you see different sizes of the window. Yeah, and you see the same trees slightly different through the different window sizes. I know this is not an optimal example. If there were a real big window, you would see the whole trees and the whole landscape. You see, okay, it's a little forest or whatever it is. Yeah, now I don't know whether it's a forest because the windows are too small. But what I can see, there are some trees. Yeah, and I can see through the smaller window, I can see more fine-grained the trees. Through the bigger window, I can see it in a more coarse-grained way. And in the same way, we probably have to imagine temple windows. Yeah, temple windows in the brain of different sizes through which the content / the input is filtered in different ways. Yeah, for instance, if you perceive me when you're in a very slow mode, you perceive me in a very different way and experience, oh, you're in a slow mode, yeah, you have no energy, oh, and you see this Northoff there, and you probably say, oh God, the guy looks depressed. However, now, if you perceive me, the same thing, same guy, perceive me in a faster window and you're in a good mood, you probably also perceive me, oh, the guy is energetic and happy. Yeah, so it shapes your perception, your experience. It's a temple scaffolding. And that's what we do here for different time scales. You see, here you see the whole seaside, longer time scale, slow frequency. You see the iceberg. You see that, and then you see slightly longer, shorter time scale, you see more context, and then it becomes really specific because here you need a short time scale, fast frequency to follow the moves of this guy. This is a typical Canadian scene because kayak is a big thing that what you can do when you come to Ottawa or Canada. And so in our brain tries to use these different time scales, these different windows, to map, track the environmental context. And that's key for consciousness. And that's really because usually the current theories of consciousness are just inside the brain or the body. So, okay. Good. See, sometimes it's good to go away. So here, now you see, you say, yes, Northoff, you showed me the neuronal mechanism, but what is the psychological mechanism? So what is the experience of that? Yeah, so here we conducted a study with a former student of mine, Andrea Scalabrini, who is now professor in Bergamo. And if you ever pass by, he's a really, really nice person. He's also a Jungian psychoanalyst and a very, very, very good neuroscientist, and psychologist. So here what we did, we investigated the self and your synchrony. So your experience or perception of synchrony with your own self and with the body and with the other and with the environment. So here basically now it's a psychological approach, a phenomenological approach. How is this alignment manifest in our experience and perception? So and that's what we observed. This was done with quantitative scales as well as visual analog scales. And what we observed to our own surprise, the degree to which you experience a synchrony with yourself, you were in, the Chinese would say, in harmony with yourself, also strongly related to how much you were in harmony or synchrony with the other, with the body and the nature of the environment. So meaning in synchrony with myself implies synchrony with the other. So it's not a contradiction between inner and outer, as we often have it in the Western world. In the Eastern world, particularly in China, they have no problems of understanding that. This is also then we had various other psychological measures, thought, trauma, sense of freedom, and you see this was really the core. Yeah, and then we also said maybe, because this was an online study with 1,000 subjects, then we said, okay, maybe we also investigated after the COVID, that was during the COVID, online study during the COVID, so we said maybe we do it also before and after the COVID, and you see after the COVID, after the isolation, you had a significant decrease in the synchrony of yourself, other, nature, and you see they all go along. So meaning your inner is not in contradiction to the outer, it's in synchrony. That's what I mean by relation. Yeah, and we also investigated that those people who did show very low levels of synchrony with self, other, environment, and body also showed higher levels of anxiety and depression. Yeah? So there you see it has a direct behavioral impact. So that's why I speak of a relational view of consciousness. Yeah? So first conclusion. Consciousness is neither inside the head nor outside in the world, but relates inside and outside. Yeah? We experience ourselves in synchrony, in relation to the other. I experience myself as part of this room, and if the room would be different, I would experience myself in a different way. That really points out the relational nature is constitutive for your consciousness. Inner, outer. These are the concept of inner, outer are artificial abstractions. Yeah? So that's what we call by temporal spatial alignment, relating the inside of the brain, relating to the outside world through adapting the dynamics of the brain inside. You use your inner brain neural dynamics to track the outer output dynamics. And you see Philip Clark is the master in that. You will see more papers from him coming out. And this is really key. So meaning your initial assumption that consciousness is in the brain is simply wrong. It's not plausible. Philosophers might argue for that on a logical ground, but in an empirical, naturalistic ground, it's not plausible. So, and that you will see carries, and you can probably already preview that, carries major implications for AI. How do you design your AI devices? You need to look for your input processing. Yeah? What's the brain, how the device tracks the temporal structure of the environment. Next one. Remember, the second error was that conscious contents are mental. And then, of course, if you ask, say, are they mental, then, of course, you ask, are they physical or not? So that's where you come at, are you have a reduction or non-reduction issue. However, if you start with the background assumption, maybe conscious contents are not mental, but temporal, then there's no question of reduction, non-reduction anymore. So, what is the mark of the mental? Some philosophers have thought that the consciousness is the mark of the mental. Everything that mental is conscious, mental states must be conscious if they exist, and so forth. You know all that. Yeah, and that's Western tradition. And here I show you one paper of one of my students from China. So he investigates thoughts, and thoughts is really, I mean, the hallmark feature of the mental. So, and what did he do? He said, well, maybe we can characterize thoughts not only by their contents, which is usually done, but by their degree of change, meaning thought dynamics. And he shows this quite nice here. He investigated in the brain certain measures, the change of your, so the brain has these phase fluctuating phases, yeah, like waves with a peak, with a trough. It's like this, and that is not always temporally precise. Let's say, for instance, in alpha in 10 hertz, you have a 100 millisecond phase cycle. However, that phase cycle is sometimes 110 millisecond long, sometimes 90 millisecond. So even that phase cycle is not as consistent. You have a phase dynamics. And that phase dynamics plays out in different time scales of frequencies. So, and here he investigated, I spare you the details, so people had to perform a task, and then they were also asked what kind of thoughts they had. Did they have, were the tasks really related, the thoughts related to the task, or were they drifting away? For instance, now you really listen to Northoff and try to understand his temporal spatial stuff, so your thoughts are fully focused on the task at hand. However, you say, hopefully he doesn't talk too long, or maybe, then I can have a nice lunch, the good Spanish food. Okay, that's what you call task unrelated thought or mind wandering. Yeah, and then he also, this was Jing Yu, who is a grad student of mine in China. He just finished his PhD. And he also asked for multiple versus single thoughts. So do I have many thoughts? The the nice lunch, and then I have to do the computer stuff, and then I need to write a summary of my exam, and I need to do this and that. So that's multiple thoughts, or you had just one thought. I really try to understand this strange lecture. Yeah, and what he investigated, okay, how the brain tracks these thoughts. So really now, instead of tracking the temporal structure of the output, now we're investigating thought tracking. And here you can show this. Here we did this in different frequencies. So this is in the frequency alpha range. We can investigate the continuous phase changes, which with a measure which is called frequency sliding. It's basically how much your amplitude changes, the frequency, based on your ongoing underlying phase waves or cycles, called frequency sliding. And what you could really observe, let's say here the single and on thoughts, the single thought and the task-related thought, so you really try to understand all your thoughts about the lecture. You see much higher activity in the alpha range for the on thoughts and the single thought than for the multiple thoughts. Yeah. So here you can really take on a moment-to-moment basis, because you get a value at each data point called frequency sliding. Goes back to Cohen 2014 J Neuroscience. You could really at each time point you get a measure, and you see the change. Here it's a much higher frequency than here. Now for the multiple thoughts and the off thoughts, which were coupled, when you had off thoughts, you didn't listen to me, you had a lot of thoughts. When you listen to me, you have only one thought. Yeah? And he could see the opposite in the theta frequency range. So this is 8 to 12 alpha, this is theta 5 to 8 hertz. And you could really see that here in the theta range was higher for the off and multiple. So what does this tell us? The brain uses different time scales, different frequencies. This is a faster time scale. That's the thought when you pay attention to me. And now when you're in a slower time scale, when that becomes stronger, you don't pay attention to me. Yeah? And we just had, I didn't include this here, Jingyu, really highly recommended. We just had a paper in Proceedings of National Academy of Science, where you also investigate explicitly different time scales of thought. And you can really say that thoughts which are more inner, yeah, more about your own self and more multiple thoughts and not about the task, they're usually slower. Whereas thoughts about the external environment are faster. Yeah? So meaning maybe our brain uses a temporal code to distinguish different kinds of thoughts. That's a very daring hypothesis. However, when you look now in psychiatric disturbances, you see temporal changes, and what else do you see? Thought changes, thought disorders. Yeah? For instance, in depression, your thoughts don't change much. It's always the same thought. Your thought dynamic is abnormally slow, called rumination. So, and that's what I show you now. So here, very probably for some of you who work in the cognitive field, what I'm doing is very uncommon, because I'm not interested in the thought content, but I'm interested in the thought dynamics. So the pattern of change of thoughts. Yeah? And so what we do here, so here it's a psychological set. We basically created a time series of thought. So we asked subjects to either report whether they have more an internally oriented thought about their own self, or an externally oriented thought about the environment. And then we asked them in 10, 20, 30, 40 second distances, and we also asked for the awareness, how aware of the thought you are. Yeah? And then we looked for the time series of thought. So basically from this allowed us to basically plot a power spectrum of your thought changes. Yeah? So we could plot the frequency, because it's the time series of thought, your awareness of thought, and your change of thought, either internal or external over time. And then you can plot a power spectrum of your thought changes. And that's exactly what we do. So this is basically the same what you do in EEG. You plot a power spectrum. But now the power spectrum is not about an EEG signal. The power spectrum is about your thought change. Yeah? And that's exactly what we do. And I show you some example here. This is a healthy subject. So here you see the frequency. Here you see the power. Yeah? And here's exactly what you see. You have in all frequencies. Sometimes your thoughts stay longer, sometimes they're shorter, sometimes they change a lot, sometimes not. And here, and sometimes they're very forceful, and sometimes not. Now look in the depressed, severely depressed subject. First you see there's no power. And that's exactly what these patients experience. I have no energy. I cannot get up my thoughts. I have absolutely no power. That's literally what they experience, a severe depressed patient. So, and you also see they're much slower. Yeah, so here they're here, and here they're here. So it's also slower. So here, so there you can see, and we can also allow this, I don't have these findings here, really show that they also distinguish between unipolar and bipolar depression. So there might also be some clinically relevant in that, because these are two forms of depression which clinically present somewhat similar in bipolar depression and mania, or major depressive disorder only depression. But it's therapeutically relevant because you treat the two forms of depression in a slightly different way. So here you see, okay, so you have the dynamic. So it's a temple structuring of the consciousness of your thought. Yeah, that's the point. Now here I show you yet another example on meditation. So here you have different forms of meditation, and what we went into the meditation, So you have different forms of meditation. Sometimes you focus your attention internally, like here in the Vipassana, you focus on your different body objects. So you focus your attention, let's say, on the nose, on the shoulder, on the hip, on the toe. Yeah, so it's called also body scanning. So you have periods of relatively regular oscillatory-like attentional periods. So you see it's a temple structure of your meditation which we're looking for. And then you have also the shunya. There's no object. You try to de-identify. You neither identify with your internal thoughts and emotions nor with the external. So it's like basically a cloud passing by. Yeah, that's what they often describe shunya. So you see completely different temple structures of these two forms of induction or meditation forms. So you see, I'm looking for the temple structure, and you see here you focus on specific objects. Here you don't have no focus. This was done by Bianca Ventura. She's from Italy, and sorry, I don't even need to go there. And she's very much into meditation. So in what we observed now, we looked for the temple windows. So because we say if you focus on particular body objects, you must have short, precise temple windows. I can see the tip of the tree very precise. It's a small window. If it were a big window, I would see a lot of other stuff and I wouldn't see the top of the tree. So, and that's exactly what we observed, that we observed the temple windows called intrinsic neural timescales, and we can measure them, which is what is called autocorrelation window. Diego knows this all too well, since we discussed it a lot. In the Vipassana, the body scanning meditation, you had a shorter temple window. Why? Because you needed a shorter temple window for your internal attention periods to the different body parts. Yeah, and we have another study which is now just submitted, where we really show that the oscillatory character is much stronger. Yeah, you have more oscillations because you have more temporal precision, shorter time interval. However, then you have this completely open meditation like shunya, where you don't focus on particular, you just pass it by. So you have you have basically no attention. You should have no attention at all, meaning you have wide window, nothing is singled out. Yeah, the Indian people call this de-identification. Yeah, you don't track your own thoughts. You just let them pass by like a cloud. Yeah. So, and you see, you have a long temple window. So, meaning what I want to say here, the temple structure of your meditation induction, shunya versus vipassana, is reflected in the temple structure of your brain. That's what we call common currency. So, I don't know why never managed to directly fit. So here's another example. So timescales. When you speak with me these days, it's all about timescales. Timescales are duration of a process, like heartbeat, 1 second, around 1 second. Breathing is a longer timescale. You have much in nature, there are abundance of timescales. 24 hours rhythm is a timescale. Yeah, and here, for me, always fascinating, the evolution geologic timescale, much longer. Same in the brain, you have different timescales. Yeah, you have shorter timescales in your sensory regions, like the visual cortex, longer timescales in the higher order region. Yeah, so there's a specific topographic distribution. It's like several timescales, several temporal windows side by side through which you basically perceive and process the environment. And that processing through these timescales provides a temporal scaffolding. That's your subjective experience. So it's basically like this. I think I already mentioned that several times. You see the same thing in different ways. Here's a yellow window. It's much larger than the violet window here, or the blue window. Yeah. So it's basically zooming in, zooming out, fine-grained, coarse-grained. And that's exactly what your consciousness is about. You have different layers. I perceive the whole room. I perceive the light. I perceive the sequences of the light. I perceive you. And you also perceive not only me. You perceive me against the background of this whole stage here. Yeah? That's your different layers of consciousness, different layers of timescale. That's why we develop a dynamic layer model of brain. Yeah. So, and that's, when you look into nature, these hierarchical layer models, they're everywhere. Yeah. So here, this is from Federico Ciglio. He's now former student of mine. He's now professor for philosophy in Padova in Italy, and he's also a neuroscientist. He does some fantastic analysis. Very, very clever guy. So he schematized it very nicely. So this scene looks simple, but it's complex temporally. Because first you need to have the time scale for the fast. This is a thief, obviously, and he is fast. So you need short time scale to capture the running. Yeah, he runs. Yeah, and then he says, no, sorry, too fast. You never catch me. Then you need a time scale for you never catch me. Because if you hadn't the short time scale for each of these words, you would not distinguish them. Yeah. But on the other hand, you need to also put those together. You need to make a relation from you to never, from never to catch, from never to me. If you cannot make the relation, it doesn't mean anything. So you need to distinguish the words and relate to them. And that means different time scale. That's exactly indicated. Now, this is based on real data here. Now, when you start becoming, so you see, and then you need a very long time scale to relate this guy, the policeman obviously, with this guy. Yeah? If you don't have the long time scale, then you cannot relate this one to this one, because you cannot integrate them. Yeah? You don't understand there's a relationship between them. No, you don't. Yeah? Then you would just, okay, there's a policeman and there's a guy, but it's not related. That's, for instance, what I sometimes see in my psychotic patients. Yeah? They cannot make the link. So, and when you become sleepy, like maybe now, your time scales become longer. So you no longer have the very short time scales. That's based on data. So we assume that your perception becomes a little blurry. You become drowsy. Yeah, when you fall asleep, or now maybe during the lecture, you're looking for the lunch. Yeah. So now when you go even deeper, and this is all the temporal window of the brain, you see now it becomes even longer. You get into N2 sleep, and your time scales become longer. It's even more blurry. And then if you're in deep sleep or anesthesia, that's what we assume is completely black, nothing. Meaning there is no differentiation anymore in your perception. So consciousness is for me a differentiation along different time and space scales. Yeah? And if you have problems with that, if you have changes in your time and space scales, then your consciousness becomes de-differentiated. That's what I often observe in psychotic patients, for instance. Then everything just focuses on the self, like in depression, but you're not able to take into view the environment anymore. So that's sort of the idea where you say, okay, temporal windows are key for consciousness, mental features are here. It's basically the same thing, but on a more neurophysiological basis. So you have inputs, These are the duration of the inputs, the objective duration, and these are your time scale lengths. This is now the brain already, the length of your time scales in the brain. If you have two shorter, yeah, then you process this, and then you have an evoked activity here. And then you, but because of this window is long, you put those two together and they evoke one activity. And that you can measure. We have empirical support for that now. And you can do this also in computational modeling. But if you have even more temporal integration, you have only one long temporal window, then you don't make a distinction between these three inputs. Yeah? So you just put them together and you perceive them as ones. So, second conclusion, conscious contents are not mental but temporal. Shaping by the intrinsic durations of your brain's timescales, temporal shaping of conscious contents. Your brain has a bag of different timescales. There's a certain hierarchy, prefrontal regions longer, sensory regions shorter, and that's really key for how you perceive and experience the input. So mental features, and I showed that by thoughts, we also show this for self, for perception, for various other examples, are intrinsically temporal for me, and also spatial, which I didn't exploit here. So, third mystery, remember that I said consciousness is special. That goes back in the Western world to Descartes, because he said there's a mind, it's different, we cannot observe it from the outside, it's first-person perspective and not third-person perspective. And that distinguishes it from the body, which we can observe in third-person perspective. So, and that specialness is sort of transferred to our time, unfortunately so. That goes, consciousness is special, different from anything else in both brain and physical world. And then, of course, we have all the discussion, is it physical or mental, public, private? I already mentioned that. So now I show you different possible constellations. That's basically, there's a non-conscious, there's the unconscious, and on top is the consciousness. Yeah, you probably know the famous iceberg picture, consciousness on top, unconsciousness beneath the water. So, and that of course goes back to Descartes, non-special brain and body, special is mind, and philosophers told us that there is a mind different from body and brain, yeah, because of the first person, and you cannot observe it. So nowadays, neuroscientists tell us consciousness is special neuronal mechanism within the otherwise non-special rest of the brain. Yeah, so you have special mechanism like a special region. I already indicated it, anterior prefrontal, global neuronal workspace theory, or posterior regions, integrated information theory, and there was a big paper in Nature, journal Nature, about this, I think in May or March this year. So, but that's basically okay, that is conceptually still the old tradition of special versus non-special. So, and that means that your consciousness is something principally different. It adds something. It adds something special which is otherwise not to be found in the rest of the brain. Yeah, so conceptually the implicit latent background assumption here is there's a difference. Of course now we locate it in the brain, but the location in the brain of consciousness is different from the rest of the non-conscious brain. Paradigma, yeah. And however, I say, how about something else? We look for similarities. We do not look for something special, but we look for something similar. What is shared between consciousness and the non-conscious brain? Yeah, and then maybe we can see maybe it's a matter of degree of certain of that feature which is shared. So, and what is shared? Now, again, you know, you already see that I like to look into other disciplines like physics, like mathematics, like biology, because there I think we can learn a lot for consciousness. So again, I always like this quote here by Nikola Tesla, engineer, you've probably heard his name, you know his name through the cars, from Elon Musk, and when you look at the bio of Nikola Tesla, he has certain similarities with Elon Musk, in both good and bad. So highly recommended. There's also Tesla Museum in Belgrade, which is very interesting. So interesting guy. He did a lot of technological invention, but he said it very nice way. If you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. And I think it's the basic truth, and I think it's really true. Now, I could basically say, if you want to find the secrets of the mind, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. So, and you already saw that I'm doing that a lot, that I already mentioned. So, different time scales. I showed you how these time scales of the environment are processed and encoded by the brain in its own time scales. I showed you that our thoughts, our mental features, are also shaped by their time scales. And so the time scales, and that's now the assumption that, for instance, time scales are shared by brain and mind, by consciousness. So what does that mean? So you're part of the Eurozone, so you share the currency with other countries. Despite the difference between Spain and Germany, you share the currency, meaning the euro. Yeah? So you have a common currency, so you have similarities as well as some differentiation. Same thing here. So that's why in this 2020 paper, and we have another paper since 2025 just came out, where we developed this idea, the common currency, and that's really a theoretical background frame for how to approach the relationship between brain and mind. So, and now the next question, of course, you say, yes, Northoff, instead of a principal differences and the specialness of brain and mind, you assume brain and mind and ultimately world share some similarities. Now, of course, you will ask, yeah, Northoff, what are these similarities? Now I need to drink a little bit, sorry. And that's where we say it's time and space. What do I mean by that? I already showed you. Thoughts are slower or faster. That distinguishes thoughts related to the task and thoughts where you go astray, mind wandering. So in depression, you experience abnormal slowness. Yeah, nothing moves, nothing changes, your thoughts don't change. You have the feeling that time is eternity, and you have the feeling you will never come out of this depression. Ask the patients, what do you see in the brain? Your brain is literally too slow. Yeah, we can measure that with tools from engineering and so forth. So that means that slowness or speed is the common currency of the brain and the consciousness in depression. And you will see in our review papers and also empirical papers a lot of support for that. That's why we now also try to investigate time series of experience or psychological time series where we can measure slowness, speed, regularity. When you are anxious, your brain is too irregular, meaning high entropy. And what do you experience psychologically? High irregularity, your perception change, your thought change like crazy, thought racing. So that's why we say time and space are the common currency of brain and mind. And as I said, in the particular here in the 2025 paper, you see a lot of updates on that. So, and that means the conclusion, consciousness is not special at all, since time and space and its dynamics are shared by world, brain, and the mental features. Remember the initial examples? You listen to music and your brain follows and tracks the rhythm of the music. Your brain becomes the music, and that's what you experience. You are the music. You're in a flow state. Yeah? That's exactly. So you're part of the music. When you ask performers, it's not that I play the piece. The piece plays itself through me. That's the kind of experiences you get. And that's not only for performers. You can ask athletes. You can ask meditation. Yeah? Because that's key, because your limited time-space scales in your brain become embedded and integrated in a much wider range of time-space scales in your environment. Yeah? And that's embedding, integrating, as we call temporal spatial alignment or nestedness, is key. So meaning for me, consciousness is completely non-special. It's the most basic features of the brain and ultimately of the natural world. When you look into previous scientific breakthroughs, that's exactly what it is. The Copernicus thought, okay, he developed a mathematical formalism that maybe the Earth is just one planet with a basic movement. Yeah, the most basic thing there in the universe, some movement, and by that he inferred it's not the center of the universe. The Earth moves. Yeah. Darwin looked for similarities between humans and non-humans. Only by that he could found evolution. If he had always assumed, like before, oh, there's a principal difference between humans and non-humans, he would have not come up with the idea of evolution. Meaning he could have gone to Galapagos and he wouldn't have perceived the similarities. Your models, your background assumption shape your perception. So, whoop, now I did a bad thing. Okay, and that's basically what we develop. Diego knows it all too well. The temporal spatial theory of consciousness, which is a work in progress, and probably next year an update will come out, just to keep you busy and ourselves too. But we really developed that as a theory continuously, and we're striving more and more also to include biology, physics, and mathematics. So, and all of that leads me to what we call spatial temporal neuroscience. So you have the brain dynamics, continues the pattern of change over time and in space. And those patterns you can measure, as I said, with different measures from signal engineering, from electrical engineering and processing. And that in turn shapes your affective, cognitive, and social functions. And there in between, that's where I would locate the mental. So your mental is no longer on top, your mental is at the very bottom. So, and that's again, I see here the time scale that consciousness is intrinsically ecological and is a continuous matching. This is a nice figure from this paper. He was an Iranian engineer who had a very good idea about how to process data, but he never learned the brain region because for him it didn't matter. He was an engineer. He was just interested in the dynamics. But brilliant guy. So here I show you now the link to AI. So now imagine you have a robot, and this is a brain. You have different time scales. You have faster time scales in your unimodal sensory regions, so longer time scales in your transmodal regions. Now, if your robot has only faster time scales, yeah, but the music the robot has to dance to has a plenty of different time scales, the robot will always be too fast. Because it doesn't have the time scales, here the longer ones, to match with the longer time scales of the music. Now the opposite. Your robot has only the longer time scales, but not the faster ones, the shorter ones. So your robot will always be too slow. It's lagging behind. So optimal is you have the variety of different time scales, and that is the highest likelihood that you can match and align to the variety of different time scales in your environmental context. So, and that can also be what we are trying to do now, maybe also in different species, different animal, human and non-human species, that based on the time scales they have, we may be able to predict how they will align to the environment / the scope and range of their consciousness. So my conclusion out of that is that artificial agents currently, because they lack this alignment, this tracking of the input dynamics, the input stochastics through the own neural dynamics, and that's an active process. An active process, they lack that. So for that reason, for now, I would assume they have no consciousness. But it's not a say that I exclude it. Maybe if they have an inner dynamics, an inner time, they may be able to align and track, and then maybe they experience something. However, it's not as easy. That the brain's inner time and its dynamics has been tuned over millions of years by the environment. There's a tuning to that. Yeah? that basically the time scales in the brain have been strongly shaped by the continuous imprinting of the environment. So there seems to be a pre-adaptive tuning, or adaptive tuning, evolutionary. So the question is, and we can see this in our own life, our timescales are tuned by our environmental context. We have strong cultural differences in the sense of self between the Eastern world and the Western world. And this is probably related to different timescales. We have data and papers on that. So it's not as easy. As I said, I don't exclude it, but for now I would say no. And what we really need to do, particularly, they're very good in single tasks, but the flexibility, the matching and alignment with the environmental dynamics. So, and that for me also has conceptual implications, because particularly the assumption of the concurrency resolves rather than answers the hard problem. You probably know the hard problem, why is there consciousness rather than non-consciousness? And I would argue, no, the problem is there because there's already, the time scales are intrinsic to the brain and matched and adaptive to the time scales of the environment, and that gives you consciousness. So for me, the mind-body problem needs to be reformulated as a world-brain problem, yeah? Because how the brain aligns actively to the world. So, and that's why I say consciousness is nothing special, it's a temporal feature of the world-brain dynamic. And with that, I'm closing, and I hope I could give some food for thought and wake you up. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Georg. It was very interesting. I think we have a bit of time for some questions, if you want to. So just raise your hand. And
first of all, thank you. The talk was really, really interesting. I'm struggling a bit with the concept of synchrony, spatiotemporal synchrony between, let's call them systems, because at the end of the talk, what I sort of concluded is that you have a sort of panpsychist view or implicit panpsychist view of the mind, because we know that many phenomena in nature are synchronized, simple physical phenomena too. So my question would be, is what is said true? Is there an implicit panpsychism in your view, since you focus on this distinction rather than demarcation? And is there a basic unit of inner experience or of consciousness? Because if there's not, then there's no distinction whatsoever to be made, and then there's no concept of consciousness to talk about.
Yeah, two very interesting questions. You must have a philosophical background, there's no doubt. so I answer mainly as a philosopher, and you'll be surprised how I answer. Very interesting how you pointed out. Basically, you make a link from synchrony over relation to panpsychism. And I answer in two ways to that. Panpsychism is an ontological metaphysical assumption. So you would say consciousness is there. But I say consciousness is in the relation. Consciousness is not in a unit which is implicitly presupposed, or whatever entity or world as entity that panpsychism presupposes. So there are, let's say, if I speak now metaphorically, you have a relation. That relation may not cover all domains of the world, if you speak in panpsychistic terms. So I'm a radical relational guy here. Yeah? And that also presupposes a relational ontology. That has some predecessors in Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, process ontology. And you see, I have two papers on Whitehead and the brain. So, and that's a radical different view that thinks not in terms of entity. And even panpsychism or materialism or whatever, they still presuppose an entity. They just determine the entity in different ways, meaning there's a clear, second question, a unity, a demarcated unity where there is experience, and I reject that. The experience is the relation. Yeah? So that's a radically different ontology that goes with, as I said, Whitehead. More recent is structural realism, and one, for instance, who also difference-based ontology, Gilles Deleuze. So you see a different question. I discussed some of that in the 2018 book. So, and that's very important. And that's where this puts me completely astray from the Western tradition and puts me in very close vicinity to the Eastern tradition. Yeah? So, and to my amazement, my philosophy is very popular in China and India. My philosophy. Because there they have no problem that consciousness is a relation. Harmony with nature. You go to Beijing, you see the temple, even the emperor bowed there. That's absolutely key. Yeah? So you see how important that is. And that different ontology lets me take into view my empirical data in a different view and analyze them in a different view. Diego suffers a lot from that. Yeah? But so that's actually, so here you see a very nice example how your model, you have your theoretical background model, often tacit, implicit, shapes how you approach empirical data. Yeah? So I would never, you will never hear me speak of a unit in the brain or unit of consciousness. Never. Yeah? I'm a radical relationalist view. And yeah,
Thank you.
I hope that makes it. For instance, notion of time, dynamic time, change from time point to time point. It's relational. It's a relational ontology.
So, thank you very much. And related with that, and sorry for trying to link with...
there you are.
Yeah,
I had
sorry.
difficulty seeing you.
So,
but I heard you.
that can be related with the Daniel Dennett position on consciousness is a kind of illusion.
Is a kind of?
Illusion.
Illusion, okay. So when you ask illusion relative to what? Illusion requires, so I again answer on the conceptual way, is a reference. Yeah? If you say that, oh, this lecture was terribly boring, it took 3 hours, but it was only 1 hour, yes. If you call that illusion, fine. I call that subjectivity. Yeah? If you call that an illusion, yes. Yeah? Hallucination for my schizophrenic patients. For them it's real. It's phenomenologically real. Yeah? Because I take the experience as extreme real. I believe so. They're convinced. Yes, it's phenomenologically real, but it's an illusion, objectively put. Yeah? But as I said, we also have these discrepancies between the objective subjective. That's an illusion. But that discrepancy is consciousness. That discrepancy, we call this, we have a mechanism for that, temporal spatial expansion. Yeah? Let's say you perceive the object is only 50 milliseconds, but it's integrated in longer time scales in the brain, so suddenly the neuronal duration underlying that event is no longer 50 milliseconds, but 300 milliseconds. That makes it more likely that you become conscious. We call it temporal spatial expansion. And that's key. And I would say that that temporal spatial expansion is not in the AI yet. So meaning your AI has no illusions, in a way, if I follow your track.
So the temper of so you explained how conscious is or how conscious exists, but that doesn't explain the subjective part of consciousness.
I didn't get the question.
I'm sorry.
Say again, it's difficult to hear.
Like with the tempo of the brain,
Yeah.
you can explain the existence of consciousness, but can you explain like that the subjective experience of consciousness or not?
What consciousness? I didn't hear that. Say so. Yeah, I would say exactly that. Yeah, so I gave you the time experience of the depressed patients. Everything is too slow. The brain is too slow too. Now you say, yes, the qualia or qualitative subjective qualities, yeah, what is a key point for Tononi, for instance, integrated information theory. I would say for me the qualia are spatial-temporal coordinates. And what we're really trying to do is spatial-temporal coordinates of your subjective experience. Like what I showed you with the thoughts. You have other paper now on music, and we have a very recent paper in PNS on thoughts, on time scales of different thoughts, even going beyond what I showed you here. Yeah, and for that what we create, and now what we're doing, what I want to do with the and we have various other meditation stuff. For instance, meditation, you have this non-duality that you don't experience a difference anymore between yourself and the environment, and they call this non-duality. And literally there's no difference in your temporal windows between internal and external processing in the brain. Yeah? So if you don't make a difference between internal and external processing, then of course you don't experience a difference. That's a common currency. Yeah? So the common currency allows me to constantly jump back between the temporal structure of your consciousness and the temporal structure of your brain. And that is for me the what it is like, or the qualia. But I think the qualia himself probably just an isolation of some phenomenological feature, which I think is also not the right way to do. But I would say yes.
And for you, the consciousness is the relation between these tempos.
Yeah, duration is an example. Let's say in mania, your brain has shorter durations, is way too fast, and you perceive everything too fast, and you act very fast. For the manic patients, we are too slow. Yeah, because the internal reference is too fast. Yeah, we're literally too slow. And if I'm too slow, you say you become impatient with me. Northoff, speed up. I'm tired of you. That's exactly what the manic patient does. So I hope you're not manic. Yeah?
Sorry for my bad English.
No problem. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your fascinating talk. Well, practices like meditation, religious experience, also psychedelics, and even tribal dances have shown to reshape the default mode network's dynamic. I was wondering how a disruption in the default mode network's subnetworks, such as core, MTL, or the dorsolateral medial prefrontal cortex, has to say, what all of this has to say in relation with psychiatric disorders, and also with the symptoms such as the one you were saying about time scales in depression. Thank you very much.
Okay, good questions, many questions. So first, default mode network. So first, the default mode network, as you know, because you know it well, is the apex of the hierarchy. And you have the unimodal, the sensory regions, and here the DMN, and here, let's say, the unimodal regions. And interestingly, that also goes, and this is strongly connected with the rest of the brain, and so forth. And it interestingly has also much longer time scales. So the DMN has long time scales, and the sensory motor has shorter time scales, which makes sense, because evolutionary, you need your sensory and motor regions to act fast. So short time scale, fast frequency. But when you move towards the DMN, there's a gradient of time scales, becomes longer and longer. I think I have that even somewhere here. Can't remember. Doesn't matter. Yeah? So you have a gradient of time scales. Where are the time scales here? They're lost. Okay, this is all the philosophy stuff. Maybe it's somewhere here. No? I can't remember. Here, on the right, you can see this quite nicely. Here, this is the red, this is the time scale, this is the longest. And that's very robust finding. So, and that has huge implications. And this is usually your more internal processes, more external. Yeah, and remember what I showed you with the internal, external thoughts. They're exactly. Your internal thoughts more recruit the DMN, longer time scale, lasts longer. Yeah, and probably the brain makes the difference between internal, external thoughts based on its time scales. Now, if your time scales become shorter here in the DMN, as in meditation or psychedelics, you don't experience the difference anymore in your thought contents as internal or external. So you see how your consciousness of the origin of your thoughts, internal, external, may be shaped temporally. That's a very radical assumption. It's not shaped by the contents, but it's shaped by the time scales. Yeah? Because then suddenly, if my time scales become short here, I may experience inner thoughts as external. That's probably what happens in schizophrenia. Yeah? And in meditation and psychedelics, this gradient is much more flat. It's no longer like this, it's more like that. We had a review paper on this in this year, DMN and inner time consciousness. So in depression, it's abnormally tilted towards the DMN. Your DMN is abnormally strong. So you have long time scales, a lot of inner thoughts, and they completely dominate over all your external thoughts. Ask the depressed patients, that's exactly what they tell you. So meaning what I want to say here, and I hope it addresses your question, from the topography here and the time scales, I can infer or predict what they should experience. Yeah? And that's exactly what we're trying now to do for consciousness, for meditation, and for psychiatric disorders. Yeah? That's the spatio-temporal approach. Now I want to see your time scales here.
Hello? Yes? Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. I have a question regarding artificial intelligence. Your main point, or your main argument, was that because artificial intelligence is not showing these temporal dynamics, therefore it is not yet showing consciousness. Then I was wondering, could this be modeled? Could engineers create temporal dynamics in artificial intelligence models to then create ultimately consciousness? This could be made from the design perspective, or on the contrary, this should emerge naturally from large models?
Yes and no. So I give you the example of language models, large language models. And there's one model which is called S-BERT. And S-BERT is basically for sentence similarity. Yeah, so they have a cosine and look for the similarity of the structure of the sentences. And they have implicitly 3 time scales for words, for combination of words, and for the whole sentences. Out of that, they create a sentence, a vector. And that vector is basically compared between the different sentences. So there are implicitly 3 time scales in there. Yeah? So now, what we did, we approached now our, and then there's also another project that, I leave that out because it's too complex. So now what we did, so now we looked, what are the time scales of the similarity of sentences? So we created a time series of these vectors, which are basically the sentence similarities. Yeah, each vector is the degree of sentence similarity. Create a time series of these vectors and looked for the fluctuation of these vectors and see whether there are longer and shorter time scales in the fluctuation of these vectors. So basically, and these S word is for semantics. Yeah, it's a semantic similarity between sentences. So now when we put in the time scales on there, that we say, okay, we look for the time scales, let's say the dynamics of your semantics. And of course now you say, you're not, if you like to play around, you're like a little baby, but that, what does it imply? It implies a lot, because we are asking ourselves, if there are fluctuations which are slower, is there a higher degree of sentence similarity? Because if you have lower fluctuation, you have longer temporal windows, meaning the sentence will be more put together. And that's exactly what we found. We found higher degrees of semantic similarities between different sentences if there were lower timescale fluctuation. Yeah. Then we also did the same. There's another project, another thing, WordNet. WordNet is basically describes abstract versus concrete words. So how distant is a word from its root cause? The more distant, the more abstract. Yeah. And let's say 1, 2, 3, 4 are very concrete. Number is a more abstract word. So again, we did the same thing. We did a time series analysis of this. And what did we observe? We observed that if you had longer time scales, you used more abstract words. If you had shorter time scales, faster frequency, you used more concrete words. So here again, you see that the time scales shape your semantics. I know that's a strong argument, which the papers are now accepted. Reviewers put a hard time on it, but that's exactly, it is true. So there's a temporal scaffold even for semantics. And I think that temporal scaffold, that by itself is not yet fully clear, because it can also change. The range of your time scale change from resting state to task state. Yeah? From resting state to task, let's say if you have paradigms which require a lot of temporal integration, your time scales become longer. So your brain is remarkably variable. Yeah? And we have a paper coming out in J Neuroscience where we show that the variability of your time scales in the resting state predict your task effect, including your task-evoked activity. Yeah? And that variability of the time scale might be evolutionary tuned. I would wonder if it's not that way. So I hope I can give a little bit more of the complexity that these, particularly the pre-adaptive process with the environmental tuning, that's absolutely key. Your brain is tuned to its environmental context. Yeah?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for your answer. Actually, I have a second question regarding that concept that you just exposed, the variability of the time scale of your brain, because you described healthy individuals with a lot of variance on that, then depressed individuals with exceptionally slow time scale, and also maniac individuals or manic episodes with faster time scales. That reminded me of the heart rate variability concept. Maybe this is more or less the same, that if you are more homeostatic, then therefore you have a more variability in time scales?
Correct, absolutely correct. Variability is key. If you're not variable, you're out of the game. Yeah, this is very clear. Our self continuously changes. So the paradox for the self for me is amazing. For me as a philosopher, it's completely crazy. You keep yourself stable through instability. However, if you too much instability is not good. Then you end up with me as a psychiatrist. You don't want that either. If you're too stable, it's not good either. If you're too stable, you suffer from depression. If you're too unstable, you become manic. So it's really the balance. Yeah, and it's remarkable. Yeah, if you don't, and change is a key feature of nature. If you don't change, don't adapt to changing environmental context, you're out of the game, you're done. Yeah, that's really key, and that the variability is absolutely key. It's your dynamic repertoire, and we all have a different dynamic repertoire. Yeah, that's why we're all so different. And that dynamic repertoire is your spontaneous brain activity, and that is strongly shaped by your upbringing, whether you had some early trauma or not, and by your cultural context, intergenerational, and now I can go all the way. Yeah. And that is missing in the AI. So I think there is discussion in the AI field, whether AI can shortcut evolution. Yes, For practical things, yes. For consciousness, I don't think so.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, good morning. Coming from a background on philosophy, I would like to ask you a question regarding the brain-mind problem. You talked about the correspondence between brain structures and mind functioning. How do you make a stance in which you can difference these two structures and not confuse one with the other?
Again, okay. So your question is, how can I claim for similarity without confusing the two?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and it's a good question. It's a very fair question. So first, the lack of confusion. They operate in different epistemological frameworks. One is phenomenological, one is neuronal. Yeah, one is experiential, one is observational. Yeah, and that, so meaning different, as I would say nowadays, different epistemological contexts, but they can still share something. Yeah, my paradigmatic example for that is water. I know it's a contentious example in philosophy, Kriepke, but nevertheless, I use it. So you have water. You know that the chemical formula of water is H2O. But water can surface in different ways. Fluid, steam, ice. In Canada, we know the last one very well. Yeah? So how is that possible? Changing environmental circumstances. So now apply the same to what I'm saying. Spatial-temporal can manifest in different ways as phenomenological and observational. So, and then now you say, then how do you imagine the transformation? Yeah? How does ice transform into fluid? Because we know the outside temperature change. We don't know that in the case of consciousness, but what we can say, and that's what my working assumption is, that you have a rescaling of your time and space scales. What do I mean by that? Your consciousness is clear, has a very narrow time scale range, from 30-50 milliseconds to 3 to 5 seconds. You will not be able to perceive consciously 10 millisecond or 1 millisecond processes. You will not be able to perceive or experience your 1 millisecond firing rate of your neuron. You don't. Yeah? You don't have the sensorium for that, / consciousness. It's not the time scale. You will not be able to perceive processes longer than 3 to 5 seconds as a continuum, because your consciousness doesn't allow you for that. The temporal continuity of your consciousness. So consciousness has a very limited time scale. Your brain has a much larger time scale range. Your environment and your body have even larger time scale ranges. Yeah? So the question is, let's say if I align to the rhythm of the music, how does that transform into the time scales of my consciousness? Since you're maybe a philosopher, what is it like to be a bat? The bat can process ultrasonar waves. We can't do that. We don't have the time scales for that. That's why the bat relates in a completely different way to the environment than us. It relates to a different time scale segment of the environment than us. But we share the world, but not the time scales within that world. Yeah? Here you see how the what is it like come in, and I hope that addresses some of the issues. You see it's a radical reversal, the way I think. And I think it was either you or the question before heart rate, of course, perfect example, heart rate dynamic, mental dynamic, heart-brain interaction. There's a lot of interaction, dynamic interaction. We have, you see a lot of papers on brain and breathing, in our case also. How do they communicate? Through time scale. Yeah? How do we communicate with the world? Through time scale. And that is consciousness.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, hello. I would like to, first of all, appreciate your talk and your point of view of this interesting work and topic. I would like to apologize myself if I don't understand everything, but in accordance with what I think I understood, some kind of therapies like meditation or maybe some psychedelics couldn't be, seems to be the best options to treat depression.
What?
Yeah. The idea is that I guess that if patients with depression disorders should be treated with psychedelics and with therapies associated with meditation, as they are more related with the slow frequencies, which is what they have in more than they should.
So my car is outside, it's full of psychedelics, yeah. Fair question. So it's a very good point. It's a very good point, because since I'm really trying to actively transform some of this into diagnostic markers and personalization of therapy. Yeah, because the mental health situation is a disaster. You don't have markers. So indeed, I would say that's what we're trying to do. We address these timescales. Yeah? Let's say if I'm depressed, let's say my timescale range between, I just make up something, between 0.05 and 0.1 is affected. Maybe if you're depressed, your time scale is mainly affected maybe from 0.06 to 0.4. Some overlap, but also some differences. Yeah? And then we need to know that the therapy, whatever it is, whether it's a drug, it's transcranial magnetic stimulation or electroconvulsive therapy, needs to address and change those timescales. Yeah, and I think that's a key problem. It is clear that there's not a one-to-one relationship between the receptor profiles of the different drugs and the symptoms and the behavior. Yeah, it's not. Yeah, you cannot make a direct link from the serotonergic drug receptor profile of an antidepressant serotonergic to the behavior. You can't, to the symptoms. Yeah, I recently spoke with a psychopharmacologist who did this since 40 years as a clinician and animal experiments. Brilliant stuff. He said, I cannot make a connection. That's a bankruptcy after 40 years of research. He's one of the leading guys, but very honest. And that, I said, that is mediated by this, let's say, as one younger colleague of mine in our institute said, by the frequency stuff. Yeah, by the time scales, by the frequency, by the regularity, irregularity, temporal precision. You will see on our website we have temporal imprecision model for psychosis. We have the speed model for depression. We have an irregularity model for anxiety. And that's exactly what I see, or the topographic changes. Yeah? So your drugs or your intervention need to address these spatial temporal changes. And if that therapy works, first, hopefully I can help these people, and it would validate the model. And that's exactly what we're trying to do these days. Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know if anyone has any other question. Okay, so the
two more questions, okay. And then we go for lunch. And you owe us a lunch. Yeah.
Okay.
So, okay.
Okay, so my question is way simpler, but it is of great interest for me because I am starting my PhD, and I have been very happy to listen to you talking about synchrony, because right now we are working on things related with synchrony, and we are trying to study the effects on different variables, but I would really like to know, to get some advice by you, because we are trying to make different ways to generate this synchrony with different tapping activities, for example, following a rhythm and trying to follow the rhythm with another person. And I would like to know which would you think could be the easiest, cheaper way to generate efficiently this kind of synchrony, either if it's with oneself, with the environment, or with another person. So yeah, that's the question.
Okay, that's of course a wide question, depends on what you want. I mean, music is one. You probably know in EEG steady state paradigms, where you present regular tones every second or every 0.5 second. Oddball paradigms, mismatch, it really depends on what you want. Yeah, the synchrony we here investigated was not just a subjective experience of synchrony, independent of external. And then you probably want to do a parametric design where you have 3 or 4 different degrees of regularity. Synchrony is regularity, is clear. And then if you do EEG or fMRI, you want to have synchrony measures. So one typical synchrony measures in EEG is what you call intertrial phase coherence. Basically your phase cycles in their phase angles are coherent relative to the onset of the timing of the stimulus. Yeah, every second, and you see a high phase coherence. You can measure that by intertrial phase coherence. And then you have also various other phase measures which you can use, for instance, in EEG, and we also adapt them to fMRI.
Thank you.
Yeah, and with a good, nice phenomenological, psychological exploration of the experience of synchrony.
Yeah, that's the part we are working.
For that,
most.
you can do visual analog scales, or you can do your EEG tone thing, and then outside the EEG, you can do a continuous sampling of your synchrony experience. Then you get a time series of your synchrony, and then you can analyze that.
So we're giving the last question. Thanks, Georg.
Thank you. Excuse my English. I will try to do my best. If not, she's going to help me. So my question is, if artificial intelligence could have these time scales and frequencies align with environment and gain consciousness, is consciousness also going to give it emotions, like feelings? Are feelings coming from consciousness?
Yeah, so your question is targeted towards emotion and consciousness, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, same thing. So indeed we are trying to work on that now, that if you have very slow frequencies, you're tending to be sad.
Yeah, I could see that from depression and the low.
Yeah, so imagine you go to the seaside, it's completely flat, no wind at all, no waves at all. The first 10 minutes you're relaxed, now I force you to stay the whole day, you become depressed. Yeah, and that's exactly what happens in depression. So our working model on that is that we indeed try that maybe there's an intrinsic connection between certain temporal features and certain emotions. Yeah. So again, the temporal scaffolding shapes your emotion, which is a daring hypothesis, but on the psychiatric side, it is really supported. You become faster, you become happy. Yeah. You become excited. If it's too much, you become manic. Yeah, yeah. But that's indeed true. But of course, the difficulty is that you may know the Plochnik scheme of emotions. There's a roundabout, it's quite popular in psychology. Different emotions like disgust, embarrassment. So, can we really provide a temporal differentiation of these fine-grained emotional differences? Ask me in 2 or 3 years. I hope I can answer. But we have a large-scale study on that. One of my postdocs, she explores it, and interestingly in China, because it's again slightly different emotional cultural context. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much for answering the questions, Georg. Thank you so much to all of you for coming today. We're going to finish the event right now, so thanks so much for coming. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. So, good job.